And The Man Who Built America is an album, as you mentioned, about emigration by a band that managed to stay at home. And you go on talking about the huge success enjoyed globally by U2. But in your opinion, what I wanted to ask you about is what were the components of the DIY method that basically they got inspired. I think you mentioned Paul McGuinness. What were the components of the DIY method that allowed for U2's success? And maybe on a side note, how some people really missed out on the boat on U2 as well. But I just wanted to ask to say on a personal note, I came to Ireland around the time when U2 were becoming successful. I had seen them in Paris. I'd actually talked to Bono in Paris because I knew Pete Wiley at that stage. And if you recall, in the press, it was always, Bono against Bono, Bono against Pete Wiley from Wa. But anyway, I remember in those days that there were some, and I think you point as well to this phenomenon. U2 were almost not part of the Irish punk scene. They were aside. They had a parallel trajectory to bands like the Virgin Prunes, despite their links with the Virgin Prunes, and we'll talk about them a little later on. But it was just, to say that they, in my mind, in my experience, they were parallel to the other Irish bands that we talked about, by the way. At the very beginning of Blitzkrieg Pop, we did 2 programs, one about the north of Ireland and one about the south, and how different the parameters were for both scenes, so to speak. But anyway, back to the DIY components of U2's early success and who missed out on them. And yes, because we don't really associate U2 either with a kind of DIY approach.
I think that's very true, and I think it's quite a dangerous misreading of U2's enterprise, of their long-term success, is to sideline the granular help that they received early in their career. Young bands need help; they need supporters, and there were some really significant things even before Paul McGuinness became involved. And great example, Adam Clayton had the managerial role. He had business cards. This was a really, really young band, but they were trying to take a business approach. I mentioned in the book that The Edge's mother, Rolling Stone described her probably laughingly as the band's first roadie, but it's very significant that at that era, in that punk era, 76 to 1980, that very few women in Ireland could drive. And very few women in Ireland had a car. And even fewer women in Ireland who had a car would have driven their son and their mates into Dublin to put up wallpaper paste with handmade posters. So the DIY, I think, is really, really important. Another DIY moment that's of huge consequence to U2 was that local journalist, Bill Graham from the Hot Press, sadly deceased, but an incredibly astute chronicler of popular music. He took U2 under his wing. And it was he who lobbied his friend from Trinity College from the Ents days, when Bill Graham was involved in Ents and Trinity, and said, you've got to see this band. This band could really do it. But he took a bit of convincing. But again, it was that DIY. Bill Graham was looking for, and if you manage them, I want 5% or 10%, or I want something out of it. It was just, I'm in the local scene. I've seen a band on the local scene that are really good. They need help. They deserve help. How can I help them? The other huge supporter of U2 in many ways early on is Steve Averill. And he just thinks, these are good guys. Their music is good. I'm a graphic artist. I'm an intelligent person. He was in the Radiators from Space. He did their graphics that look fantastic. And he gave them advice. He gave them their name. And again, he wasn't, look, if I give you a good band name, I want 5%. This is what happens in the DIY world. People help each other. Now, you mentioned U2 and punk, and they don't really fit, but you've got to realize that there was no punk movement with a lot of momentum in Ireland, because in the first major punk gig with bands from both sides of the border, a young guy, Patrick Coultree, was stabbed to death. So punk went very, very underground. And it really is in post-punk that you see the gift of punk. And the gift of punk is do it yourself, challenge things, see if you can be creative, see if you can do something that's a bit purposeful, a bit different, express yourself. So we in the South, very, very strange relationship with punk during those 4 key years globally. Northern Ireland, different story.
Yeah.
But U2 absolutely benefited from that local support. They were noticed by a publisher in England, a guy called Brian Morrison, and he said, I'll give you a publishing deal. And I think this is great. And that'll pay for us to go to England, and we'll do shows around London, and hopefully record labels, will get interest in us. And just before they were going to go on that trip, he said, now I don't know the exact figures, but I know very close to what they are from what the band and the manager spoke about. It was around $2,500 he'd offered them. And then he decided to drop it, possibly by $1,000. And the band said, no, absolutely not. So they turned down a deal that they had agreed to because the person wanted to adjust it by a few £100. Now, the amount of money he lost is fascinating to even think about. We don't know what portion of U2's publishing he would have owned forever, but we do know that he lost it based on trying to save a couple of £100 from this Irish band that he felt, well, they have to take the deal because I know they don't have any money. So the only way that U2, this is how poor they were, U2 were only able to do those gigs because Bono's girlfriend's parents lent them some money, along with some of Paul McGuinness's friends that he knew from college, including Tiernan McBride, who I think was Sean McBride's son. Wow. And those people lent money to these young guys who were making music, and there was no way of telling whether they'd ever turn a profit or not, but it was done out of that DIY goodness.
Let's do something positive.
Let's do something. Let's help some. They're trying, so let's support them. And then the other huge moment is Phil Chevron from the Radiators from Space. He's in London, and there was another trip again funded by Alison Stewart's family, Bono's girlfriend at the time, who became his wife. And Phil Chevron introduced him to people, including the person who then gave U2 the first magazine cover before they had a record deal. So the generosity, the no strings attached approach of DIY, the community spirit was of huge consequence, and it saved U2 from signing a portion of their publishing forever for a couple of grand. Now, what happens is that U2 signed to Island Records eventually, thanks, I think, to their stature brought about by the DIY community in Ireland, and they and obviously their music as well. And they signed their publishing to Island as well, because most record labels didn't want to sign U2. They thought they weren't going to pay off. And later, Island couldn't pay them the money that they owed them. And because of that, because they were signed for publishing and their records, they got their publishing back. Now, there's no better gift in the music industry than getting the publishing that you've signed away, the portion of your songwriting rights that you've signed away. And all of that happened because of the generosity of the DIY community.